This story is called My Dad Replaced Me with My Stepmom's Kids, so I finally stood up for myself and walked away. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel has been losing some momentum, and subscribing is one of the easiest and most effective ways you can support us. It's fast, free, and helps us keep bringing you amazing content. Your support truly means a lot. Let's continue growing this channel together. Thanks so much. Now, let's dive into the video. Hey everyone, I've been debating whether to share this because it's honestly a lot to unpack. But I feel like I need to get it off my chest, so here it goes. Growing up, my dad, Mitchell, and I were inseparable. He was my hero, no exaggeration. My parents divorced when I was 8. But it wasn't one of those ugly, messy separations you hear about. They both worked things out for my benefit. I stayed with my mom during the week, but weekends were all about Dad. Those weekends were the best part of my week. He'd pick me up after school on Friday, and I'd practically leap into the car, already excited about whatever plans he had for us. Dad wasn't one of those distant fathers who let me sit in front of the TV while he did his own thing. He made every weekend special. We'd go hiking, or he'd teach me how to fix things around the house. Sometimes we'd just relax watching documentaries because he knew I loved learning random facts. He was always telling me how proud he was of me. Like always. If I aced a test, or did something small like winning a spelling bee, he'd look me in the eyes and say, "You're my smart, strong girl." Those words meant the world to me. For a long time, I believed nothing could ever come between us. But when I turned 13, things started to change. That's when Dad met a woman named Camille. At first, I didn't mind her at all. She was bubbly, friendly, always asking about my school or my favorite books. She had 2 kids from her previous marriage, Evan, who was 12, and Maddie, who was 10. They seemed nice enough, and for a while I even thought it might be fun to have siblings. Then they moved in, and that's when everything started to change. Camille quit her job not long after, saying she wanted to focus on family life. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it meant Dad had to work extra hours to support everyone. He started coming home later and later, and when he was home, all his attention went to Camille and her kids. I tried to adjust, telling myself it was just a new family dynamic, and things would settle down eventually. But the more time passed, the more I realized that settling down just meant I was slowly becoming invisible. Dinner conversations were all about Evan's baseball games or Maddie's ballet recitals. I'd mention something I was excited about, like the science fair project I'd worked hard on, and all I'd get was a polite, "That's great, sweetie," before the conversation shifted back to them. It wasn't just the small stuff, though. Camille's kids always seemed to come first, no matter what. I remember one summer, I really wanted to visit my grandparents, Dad's parents. It was something we did every year, and I looked forward to it. But Camille suggested we go to a theme park instead, because Maddie had never been to one. Guess whose plans got canceled? Mine. But things took a turn for the worse during my junior year of high school. That night, Mom sat me down and said, "There's something you need to know about your college fund." She told me Dad had used all of it. I was in complete shock. "What do you mean, he used it?" I asked. Apparently, Dad had drained the fund to pay for Evan's private school tuition. Camille had convinced him that Evan was struggling at public school and needed a better environment. So Dad took the money he'd saved for my future and used it on her son. Mom only found out because she asked Dad about the fund while they were sorting through some old paperwork. She thought I had the right to know. I didn't even wait to process it. I called my dad that night and asked if it was true. At first, he tried to downplay it, saying Evan really needed the help and that we'd figure something out for my college. I remember sitting on the phone, completely stunned. "Figure something out?" I asked. That was my college fund. How could you just spend it without even talking to me? His response was, "You're smart. You'll be fine. Your mom can help, and I'll pitch in where I can when the time comes." Like it was no big deal. I hung up on him and cried for hours. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of it. This was the same man who'd always told me I was his #1 girl. The same man who promised he'd always have my back. Yet when it came down to it, he chose Camille's son over me. It wasn't just about the money. It was the fact that he didn't even consider how this would affect me. When I finally talked to him again, he doubled down. He said Evan was struggling and needed a better school, and that I'd understand someday. But I didn't understand. Not then, and not even now. All I could think about was how unfair it was. He had promised that money was for my education, and now it was gone. A few months later, as if draining my college fund wasn't bad enough, I found out Dad had bought Evan a brand new SUV for his 18th birthday. My stomach sank when I heard it. I couldn't believe it. He had told me he couldn't afford to help with my tuition, but somehow he had money to buy a luxury car for Camille's son. I could clearly see how much Evan was struggling. After that, our relationship changed. I didn't look at him the same way anymore. Every time I went to his house, it felt like I didn't belong. Camille would make little comments about how I didn't visit often, but when I did, it was always the same. Dinner conversations revolved around Evan and Maddie, and any attempt I made to talk about my own life was brushed aside. It wasn't just about the college fund, it was a pattern. I missed my school events because Maddie had a recital. Family vacations were planned around their schedules. Every decision he made seemed to prioritize them over me. By the time senior year rolled around, I had stopped expecting much from him. I still saw him occasionally, but it felt more like an obligation than something I wanted to do. The man who used to make me feel like the most important person in the world had made it clear where I stood in his new family dynamic, and it wasn't at the center. So, my relationship with Dad felt more like a chore than anything else. Every visit, every conversation, it all felt forced, like we were just going through the motions. I'd stopped expecting much from him after the whole college fund issue, but the way things played out over the years showed me just how far down the totem pole I'd fallen in his life. I didn't cut him off completely, though. I still visited on weekends occasionally, mostly because Mom encouraged me to. "She's still your mother," she'd say, like that made everything okay. But every time I stepped into that house, it felt like I was a guest in someone else's home. Camille and her kids had completely taken over. One weekend, I showed up and immediately regretted it. The second I walked through the door, Camille started in with, "Oh, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence." She said it with a fake smile, but her tone was anything but playful. I just laughed it off. But inside, I was seething. I mean, really? I'm the one making the effort to visit, and that's what I get? Dinner that night was exactly what I expected. Camille spent half the meal talking about how Maddie's dance recital was coming up, and how stressful it was for her to juggle everything. Evan chimed in about his baseball tryouts, and of course, Dad was fully engaged, nodding along and asking questions. I sat there, trying to find a moment to share something about my own life. When I finally mentioned that I'd been accepted to a few colleges, Camille barely let me finish, before turning the conversation back to Maddie's rehearsal schedule. Dad didn't even notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. I sat there, staring at my plate, wondering why I even bothered. It wasn't just the family dinners, though. It was everything. Camille had this way of making me feel like an outsider without ever being outright rude. Like when she'd plan family outings without even asking if I wanted to join. I'd only find out later when Maddie or Evan would mention casually how enjoyable their time had been at the zoo, the movies, or some other place. On one occasion, I overheard them talking about a camping trip they were planning for the weekend. When I asked Dad about it, he simply shrugged and said, "Oh, I didn't think you'd be interested." "Really? We used to go camping all the time, it was our thing. But now it felt like I didn't even exist." The worst part was how natural it all seemed to them. Camille treated me like I was a distant relative who visited occasionally, not Dad's real daughter, and Dad just went along with it, acting like this was the way things were supposed to be. I tried talking to him about it once, but he dismissed me, saying, "You're overthinking it. You've got your own life now. You don't need to be here all the time." Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't need to be there. But it still hurt. By the time spring came, I had emotionally detached. I still visited from time to time, but I kept my distance. I'd sit through dinner, nodding and smiling at the appropriate times, but I wasn't really engaged. It felt like I was just a spectator in my own family, watching from the sidelines while they carried on with their lives. One weekend, I decided to test things out and see if Dad even noticed how disconnected I was. I barely said a word during dinner, just nodding along as they discussed Maddie's recital and Evan's baseball games. Dad didn't speak to me at all during the meal. Not one question about school or my college plans. Camille, of course, filled the silence, going on about how difficult it was to manage everything with 2 kids, as if I wasn't sitting right there. Also, his kid. After dinner, I tried to have a private conversation with Dad. I asked if we could go for a walk, just the 2 of us, like we used to. He agreed, but halfway through, Camille called his phone. I couldn't hear what she said, but it must have been urgent because he cut our time short. "Sorry, sweetie," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "Camille needs me for something at home." And that was the end of it. I rarely visited after that. At first, I felt guilty, like I was abandoning Dad. But honestly, it hurt less to stay away. I focused on school and started a part-time job to save for college, especially since Dad's promise to figure something out was clearly empty. Mom did her best to help, but things were tight financially. Honestly, Mom was my biggest supporter. She wasn't just there for me, she was my rock. Every time I came home feeling invisible or frustrated after a weekend with Dad, she was there with a listening ear and my favorite cup of tea. I didn't bring up anything about my life to Dad. What was the point? He was too busy playing Super Dad to Camille's kids to notice anything I was going through. The final straw came a few weeks before my high school graduation. I'd been hoping, praying, that Dad would actually show up this time. It wasn't like I asked him for much in the past year. All I wanted was for him to be there to watch me walk across that stage and hear my name called. But a week before the ceremony, Camille called me. Not Dad, Camille. She said, "Hey, just wanted to let you know that Dad won't be able to make it to your graduation. Maddie's dance competition is that same day, and you know how important that is to her." I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there, holding the phone, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. She didn't apologize. She didn't even pretend to care about how I felt. It was just, Maddie's thing is more important. End of story. I didn't bother calling Dad to argue. What was the point? He had already made his choice, just like he always did, and I wasn't expecting anything from him anymore. After everything, the college fund being drained, him missing my graduation, and constantly putting Camille's kids first, I had lowered my expectations to basically nothing. Even so, when his 50th birthday was coming up, I still wanted to do something. It felt like one of those things you just have to do, you know? No matter how distant we'd become, he was still my dad. A week before his birthday, I picked out a gift for him. It wasn't anything fancy, just a book about World War II history. Something I knew he'd love. He had always been a history buff, and we used to talk about that stuff all the time when I was younger. It seemed like a thoughtful choice, something that might remind him of the bond we once shared. On his birthday, I decided to stop by his house after work to drop it off. I didn't call or text ahead because I figured it would just be a casual visit. I thought we'd talk for a bit. I'd give him the gift, and that would be that. But when I pulled into the driveway, I immediately knew something was off. The house was lit up, cars lined the street, and I could hear music and laughter coming from the backyard. For a moment, I thought I had the date wrong. But no, it was definitely his birthday. I sat in my car trying to process what I was seeing. I wasn't invited. That realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a small family gathering, it was a full-blown party, and I wasn't even told about it. Part of me wanted to drive away, just leave the gift on the porch, and pretend I hadn't come. But another part of me, the part that still hoped things could be fixed, decided to go in anyway. I knocked on the door, and Camille answered. Her smile faltered when she saw me, like she was trying to figure out what I was doing there. "Oh," she said after a pause, "we didn't know you were coming." I forced a smile and held up the gift. "I just wanted to drop this off for Dad. Is he around?" She hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let me in. "He's in the backyard," she said, gesturing toward the noise. I could feel her eyes on me as I walked through the house, and I had to hold back the urge to ask why I wasn't invited. The backyard was packed. There were string lights everywhere, a catered buffet along one side, and even a DJ in the corner. It looked like something from Pinterest. Dad was by the grill, laughing with a group of relatives I hadn't seen in years. When he saw me, he waved me over. "Mallory!" he called, pulling me into a brief hug. "I wasn't expecting you." I handed him the gift. "Happy birthday," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He opened it right there and smiled when he saw the book. "Wow, this is great. Thanks, kiddo." For a moment, I almost forgot why I was upset. He seemed genuinely happy to see me, which reminded me of the dad I used to know. But that moment passed quickly, as I stood there, surrounded by people who all knew about the party, people who had been invited, while I was clearly an afterthought. "Did Camille not tell you about the party?" Dad asked casually, as if it was a minor oversight. "No," I replied, trying not to sound as hurt as I felt. "I just came by to drop off your gift. I didn't know there was a party." His face fell for a second, but he quickly recovered. "Well, I'm glad you're here now," he said. "Grab a plate and stick around." But the way he said it didn't feel welcoming. It felt like an obligation, as though he was trying to smooth things over without addressing the real issue. I stayed for about 20 minutes, just long enough to make small talk with a few relatives and eat a plate of food. Camille kept hovering nearby, watching me like she was afraid I'd cause a scene. I thought about confronting Dad right then and there, asking him why I wasn't invited. But I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of everyone. When I left, I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, wondering if I'd done something to deserve being left out. Was it because I didn't visit enough? Because I didn't fit into their perfect family dynamic? Was Camille the problem? But no matter the reason, I was already an outsider in my own father's life. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I felt this heavy weight pressing on my chest, unable to concentrate on school or work. Every time I thought about the party, a mix of anger and sadness overwhelmed me, emotions I couldn't quite express. It wasn't just about the party. It was everything: the college fund, the graduation, the ongoing favoritism. That party was simply another painful reminder that I wasn't important in his life. I tried to push it aside, telling myself it didn't matter, but deep down, I knew it did. It mattered a lot. I didn't call Dad after that, and he didn't reach out to me either. Weeks passed, and the silence between us only grew. I thought he might eventually call to apologize or explain why I wasn't invited. But that never happened. It was as if the entire situation was erased from his mind. Eventually, I realized I was holding on to something that was long gone. The dad I once looked up to. The one who used to make me feel like I was his entire world. Maybe he had never really been there, and I had just been too young to notice. Either way, it shattered something in me, and no matter how much I wished to fix it, I couldn't do it on my own. Then came Maddie's engagement. I found out in the same way I discovered most things about Dad's new life, through social media. There it was, on my feed. A photo of Maddie smiling widely with an enormous diamond ring on her finger, surrounded by a crowd of unfamiliar faces. Of course, Dad and Camille were front and center, looking like proud parents. The caption read, "Can't wait to marry the love of my life. Thanks to my amazing family for making this day so special." At first, I thought maybe the engagement party was a small, last-minute event, so I tried not to assume the worst. But as more photos appeared, it became clear that this wasn't just a casual gathering, it was a big event, with decorations, catered food, and even a photo booth. And guess who wasn't invited? Not me. I didn't call Dad to ask why. What was the point? He'd either blame Camille like he always did, or act like it wasn't a big deal. So, I stayed silent and told myself I didn't care. But it was hard not to care when every few days someone new was posting pictures of the party. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them smiling, laughing, as if this was the happiest moment of their lives. I thought maybe the wedding would be different. Surely, I would get an invitation to that, right? After all, a wedding is a big deal, and even though I wasn't close to Maddie, I was still family. Or, at least, I was supposed to be. Weeks passed, and I didn't hear a thing, not a phone call, no text, no invitation in the mail. I tried convincing myself that maybe the invites hadn't gone out yet. But when I asked a cousin, she let it slip that the invitations had already been sent out weeks ago. "I'm sure yours is on the way," she said, giving me a look that made it clear she knew that wasn't true. A few days later, I received a text from another cousin. It said, "Hey, Maddie wanted me to let you know the wedding is on date at location. Hope you can make it." That was it. No explanation for why I hadn't been told sooner. No acknowledgement that I was family. Not even a direct invite from Maddie or Dad. Just a lazy, second-hand message passed along as though I were their neighbor. It didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like a formality they couldn't be bothered to handle properly. I stared at the text for a long time, trying to figure out how I felt. Hurt? Yes. Angry? Definitely. But more than anything, I just felt exhausted. Tired of always being the afterthought. Tired of trying to force myself into a family that didn't seem to care if I was part of it. For a brief moment, I considered going. Maybe showing up would keep the peace. Maybe prove I was the bigger person. But then I thought about what it would really be like. Sitting in the back, watching Maddie beam while Dad gave a speech, probably calling her the daughter he was so proud of, while I sat there wondering why he couldn't ever say those words about me anymore. I realized I couldn't do it, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because I needed to protect myself. Going to that wedding wasn't going to fix anything. It wasn't going to magically make me a part of their family. If anything, it would just be another reminder that I was on the outside, looking in. I decided not to go. I didn't tell anyone, or make a big deal about it. I just quietly made the decision and stuck to it. Of course, Dad wasn't going to let it slide. A few days later, he called. The moment I saw his name on the screen, I knew what the conversation would be about. "Mallory," he began, and I could already hear the irritation in his voice. I just heard from Camille that you're not planning to come to Maddie's wedding. Is that true? Yeah, I said, keeping my tone calm. I decided it's better if I don't. Better, he repeated, as though the word made no sense. How is that better? She's your stepsister. This is one of the biggest days of her life, and you're just not going? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Dad, I don't feel like I'm really wanted there. It's obvious this invitation was sent out of obligation, not because anyone actually cares if I come. I think it's better for everyone if I stay home. He scoffed, and I could picture him shaking his head on the other end. Not everything has to be about you, Mallory. This isn't about whether you feel wanted or not. It's about Maddie. This is her big day, and you're making it about your feelings. Can't you put those aside for once? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. Dad, this isn't just about the wedding. It's about everything. The college fund, my graduation, your birthday party, the engagement party. Do you not see how many times I've been excluded? How many times I've been made to feel like I don't matter? Jesus, Mallory, he snapped. You're always so dramatic. Camille has worked so hard to keep this family together, and all you ever do is complain. Maybe if you tried being more supportive, things wouldn't feel so tense. Supportive? I repeated, my voice rising. You're telling me to be supportive when I've been left out over and over again? You spent my college fund on Evan. You missed my graduation for Maddie's recital. You didn't even invite me to your birthday party. And now you're telling me I'm the one who isn't supportive? That's not fair. He quickly tried to cut me off, but I could hear the guilt creeping into his voice. You know it's not like that. Really? Because it feels exactly like that, I said. It feels like you've chosen Camille and her kids over me every single time. And the worst part is, you don't even care how much it's hurt me. There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought he might actually apologize. But instead, he sighed and said, Look, I don't have time for this. You're either coming to the wedding, or you're not. Just know that if you don't, it's going to cause problems. Maddie will be upset. Camille will be upset. And I really don't want to deal with that. Then don't, I said, my voice sharp. Deal with your perfect little family and leave me out of it. I hung up before he could respond. The days leading up to the wedding were harder than I expected. I tried to focus on school and work, but my mind kept drifting back to that conversation. I replayed his words over and over, trying to figure out where I went wrong. Was I really being selfish? Dramatic? Was it too much to want to feel like I mattered? On the day of the wedding, I stayed home. I turned off my phone and tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't focus. I kept picturing Dad standing up to give a speech, talking about how proud he was of Maddie. The thought made my stomach twist. A few days later, I found out through a cousin that Camille had been bad-mouthing me at the reception. She told anyone who would listen that I was jealous of Maddie and didn't care about family. It hurt, but honestly, it wasn't surprising. Camille had been painting me as the villain for years. What surprised me was that some people actually believed her. I received a few texts from extended family members saying they were disappointed in me for missing the wedding, like I'd committed some unforgivable sin. I didn't bother replying. I knew there was no point in trying to explain myself to people who had already made up their minds. At that point, I realized I couldn't win. No matter what I did, I would always be the bad guy in their eyes. If I stood up for myself, I was dramatic. If I stayed quiet, I was unsupportive. And if I walked away, I was selfish. Something had to change. I couldn't keep bending over backward for people who didn't even want me around. I tried to move on after Maddie's wedding. I gave up waiting for calls or messages from my father and started focusing on my own life. A few months later, I learned from a cousin about yet another family gathering. This time it was a backyard barbecue at my dad and Camille's place. It was a large event with extended family invited. meant to celebrate Evan's college graduation. Of course, I wasn't invited. I wish I could say I was shocked, but by now, it was expected. Even so, finding out through someone else still hurt, especially since Evan's graduation was such a big deal that they threw a full-blown party, while my own barely got a mention. I tried to brush it off. What was the use of dwelling on it? But as the days passed, the anger grew. Why did they get to pretend I didn't exist? Why did Dad get to act like a proud, devoted parent while ignoring the damage he'd done to our relationship? It's not like I'd done something to deserve being excluded. I wasn't going to let them get away with it this time. I had reached my limit, tired of being pushed aside, and wanted to confront them. On the day of the barbecue, I got in my car, drove to their house, and walked straight to the front door. I didn't knock or hesitate. I simply opened the door and walked in. The sound of laughter and music spilled out from the backyard, and for a moment I stood there, taking it all in. The house was packed with relatives I hadn't seen in years, people who hadn't even texted me but somehow showed up for this. I could hear congratulations being shouted, laughter filling the space, and the clinking of glasses. Camille was the first to see me. She was walking through the living room with a tray of drinks when she noticed me by the door. Her face froze for a second in surprise before twisting into that familiar fake sugary smile. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said, setting the tray down. "Did you finally remember where your father lives? Or did your mother teach you another trick to get attention?" Her words hit like a slap. She had always been passive-aggressive, but this time, she didn't even bother hiding her disdain. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice shaky. "Oh, don't act innocent," she snapped, her smile vanishing. "You've always been like this, selfish, dramatic, just like your mother. She's the one who taught you to behave like the world revolves around you." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, my dad walked in from the backyard. His eyes widened when he saw me standing there. "Mallory, what are you doing here?" "I came to see my family," I said, stressing the word family. Camille let out a short, bitter laugh. "Family? That's rich, coming from someone who skips her stepsister's wedding and can't be bothered to pick up the phone." "Are you serious?" I shot back. "You didn't even invite me to this party. I found out through a cousin. How many more times are you going to leave me out before you admit you just don't want me around?" The room fell silent. For a moment, I thought Dad might finally defend me, but instead, he turned to Camille. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. "What's going on," Camille responded, crossing her arms, "is that your daughter barged in and decided to make a scene." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Make a scene?" I repeated. "I wouldn't have to make a scene if you treated me like I mattered instead of always putting Evan and Maddie first." Dad turned to me then, his face hard. "That's enough, Mallory. You don't get to come into my house and disrespect my wife." "Your wife?" I snapped, anger boiling over. "She's the one disrespecting me, and she's been doing it for years while you stand by and let it happen." "Don't blame me for your problems," Camille said venomously. "You've been nothing but a thorn in this family's side. You're just bitter because you can't stand that my kids are more successful than you. That was the last straw. You mean Evan, who had my college fund handed to him on a silver platter? Or Maddie, who's had everything given to her while I've been working hard to get through school? Don't pretend this is about success. It's about you trying to erase me from my own family." Dad stepped in, raising his voice. "Mallory, stop! You're embarrassing yourself." "No, Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm embarrassing you. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You don't like it when I remind you of how much you've let me down." His expression darkened, and for the first time, I saw just how deep his loyalty to Camille ran. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said coldly. "Camille has done more for this family than you ever have. If you can't accept that, maybe you should leave." Gasps rippled through the room. A few family members exchanged awkward glances. My Aunt Denise, one of the few relatives who had always been kind to me, looked shocked. "That's too far," I heard someone mutter. Meanwhile, Camille stood behind Dad, arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at her lips. She didn't look surprised by his words. If anything, she looked satisfied, as if this was the reaction she'd been waiting for. The word stung, but I refused to show it. Instead, I pulled out the legal papers I'd been holding on to. "Fine," I said, my hands shaking as I thrust them toward him. "If I don't belong here, then deal with this. It's a formal claim for the college fund you took from me. Maybe Evan's private school and new SUV were worth it, but I'm not letting you get away with it anymore." The room fell silent again. Camille's mouth opened and closed, and Dad just stared at the papers, his face pale. "You want to talk about family?" I said, my voice rising. "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't treat their own like strangers. You've been a puppet for Camille, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Without waiting for a response, I turned and left. Behind me, I could hear voices rising as the chaos I'd caused sank in. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control instead of letting things happen to me. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest. I'd said what I needed to, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something I'd been holding on to for far too long. 2 weeks after the barbecue, Dad finally reached out. I let it go to voicemail. His message was exactly what I expected, full of anger and blame. "Mallory, I can't believe you're doing this," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "You're really going to drag the family into legal drama over some money? Evan needed that school, and you've had plenty of chances to figure out your own path. I can't believe you'd stoop this low." I deleted the voicemail without replying. What was there to say? He wasn't even trying to understand my side or take any responsibility. To him, I was the villain, and Camille was probably encouraging that view as usual. A week later, I got a letter from his lawyer. Dad was contesting my claim, arguing that the college fund had always been family money, and that he had the right to use it as he saw fit. It felt awful, but I wasn't surprised. If I'd learned anything, it was that Dad would do whatever it took to avoid admitting he was wrong. My lawyer, thankfully, was ready. We had proof that the fund was specifically for my education, with documents showing my name as the beneficiary. This wasn't just about money. It was about holding him accountable for years of broken promises. The legal process dragged on for months. During that time, Dad's calls became less frequent, and when he did reach out, it was never to apologize. Instead, he blamed me for tearing the family apart. Camille wasn't subtle either, posting vague but pointed comments on social media about ungrateful people. Meanwhile, family members started taking sides. Some reached out to support me, saying they'd seen how unfairly I'd been treated. Others sided with Dad, telling me I was being unreasonable and should just let it go. One aunt even called to say, "It's just money, Mallory. Is it really worth ruining your relationship with your father?" But it wasn't just about money. It was about my future, my trust, and my dignity. All things Dad had trampled without a second thought. I was done pretending otherwise. When the case finally went to mediation, our documentation was solid, and every excuse Dad offered was met with evidence to the contrary. At one point, he even said, "I thought Mallory was smart enough to figure out college without the fund." The mediator shut him down, pointing out that the fund wasn't his to decide how to use. It had been set up for me, and using it for anything else, especially without my consent, was a breach of trust. In the end, Dad agreed to settle. He didn't apologize or even look at me. The settlement required him to repay a significant portion of the fund over the next few years, But it wasn't the money that mattered. What mattered was that, for once, he couldn't just sweep his actions under the rug. After the settlement, my contact with Dad became almost non-existent. The few times he reached out, it was out of obligation, not any real desire to repair things. Our relationship, if you could even call it that anymore, was fractured beyond recognition. And maybe that was for the best.